Welcome to everyone, and especially a warm welcome to the Ukrainians, Syrians, and Palestinians that are here today. We recognize all that you have endured and all that you are enduring. My name is Cheryl Zuur, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. If you don't know much about us, Megan's going to post the link to our link tree in the chat. We were formed in March of 2022, right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of our public forums are recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in being on our mailing list to receive invitations and notifications about future forums like this one, please send a message to John Ryman in the chat with your email. So the idea for this forum actually began in April of 2023 around Earth Day, when we got a request from Ukrainian climate change activist Svetlana Romanko asking us to please help respond to Code Pink's campaign, well, their exploitation of Earth Day as an event to call for an end to aid to Ukraine, for a ceasefire, and for Biden to call for negotiations with Russia. So this is the 2023 Code Pink call for a ceasefire in Ukraine now. So we realized, and of course, Code Pink and Medea Benjamin specifically had said, we are going to get the climate change movement and the environmental movement on board with our position on Ukraine and ending aid, and they've made some headway along with the Kremlin. So there was a list of environmental organizations which had allegedly signed on to this this call, and a couple of them had not signed on to it. It was 350.org and the San Francisco branch of Youth Apocalypse. And so we learned that these organizations had not even been asked to sign this letter, and that Code Pink had fraudulently put their names on it, and they requested to have their names removed. That's just some of the tactics that Code Pink gets up to sometimes. So part of our purpose from the beginning has been to challenge and debunk the massive Russian disinformation campaign that began with Syria and has continued on to Ukraine. And in the process of organizing this forum, focusing on the environmental costs of invasions, we've unfortunately seen that this disinformation campaign has reached deep into the environmental and climate change movement. We can just name it the Putinization of environmentalism, especially in the global south. So these are the reactionary forces of the Kremlin trying to co-opt the climate change movement, particularly, again, amongst people of color, including the United States. We know this is what they're up to, and we know that the Kremlin explicitly targets the global south because it's confusing for people. So as we began to make a list of organizations that we wanted to invite to this forum, we were really concerned to see that many of them had various degrees of Russian anti-Ukraine propaganda on their websites. And here's another example. John, can you show that slide number 2? So this is a group that was brought to our attention by someone in the UK. And it's, well, this is a screenshot of the Instagram page from an organization that calls itself the Pan-African Reparations International Standing Conference. So the arrow on the left points to a woman named Gail Braddock, who is a co-founder of the climate change group Extinction Rebellion. The man on the right is Robin Ellis Cockcroft, also with Extinction Rebellion, and the group Planet Repair Action Learning Educational Revolution, also known as PRALER. And both of these people have really murky ties to the world of disinformation. But the most revealing of the Pan-African Reparations ISC is this open letter, which is the next slide, John. This letter, signed by Claire Daly and Mick Wallace, who are well-known Putin assets. So these are just a few examples of some of the distressing things that we found out there. I encourage you to do your own deep dive and see what you find in the world of climate change and the environmental movement in terms of their position on Ukraine and related. So our task today going forward has several parts. One is to gain a deeper understanding of the ways in which the genocidal invasions of Ukraine, Palestine, and Israel's attacks in Southern Lebanon and the fight for democracy and freedom in Syria have damaged the land and other natural resources. The second is to think about how to unite these struggles so they have a chance for victory. And the third is to consider the limitations of capitalism and the harsh reality that it has no capacity to solve the environmental and climate change crises, given its insatiable need for growth, profit, and competition for markets. I want to clarify one point before introducing our speakers. We are not pacifists. We oppose wars of aggression and imperialist invasion, but we support the right of self-defense of all oppressed peoples everywhere and stand for victory and liberation in Ukraine, Syria, and Palestine. We have two speakers today. We're really honored to have them. And in between their presentations, we will listen to an excerpt from Elia Ayoub's podcast, The Fire These Times, about the devastation on agricultural lands in southern Lebanon perpetrated by Israel, featuring Michelle Aid. Some of you may know her work.
At this point, we've had to edit this video for security reasons.
Okay, Megan's got a portion of this podcast queued up for us, and we're going to be about, 4 minutes.
Yep. So this is an audio clip that's excerpted from the Fire These Times podcast episode titled The Israeli War in Southern Lebanon. And so the soundbite is Michelle Eid discussing the topic of the Israeli war in southern Lebanon. And after this, Bushra will share her presentation on Syria, and will also at the end touch on Israel's assault on Palestinian land as well.
Is not an island. And in a lot of ways, Lebanon is connected to the wider regional struggles, in Palestine, in Syria, and beyond. So, Michelle, you had brought up the use of things like white phosphorus. This is the thing that we've seen in Gaza. And Michelle, you shared an article a while back that I took note of, which was a Washington Post article from the 82 siege. So in a sense, we can see what's happening today. In some ways, there is a connection to the region, but also to the past. So we can talk about, for example, the 82 siege of West Beirut and the Israeli invasion, ongoing occupation. We can also talk about 2006. Michelle, in some of your writing, you've connected what's happening today to the past, and I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about that work you did and kind of drawing these links to, or let me ask you, what does drawing these links show to you, and what do you think that can show to many of the people listening?
I guess I can start this by saying, by looking at these previous conflicts that have happened, or the invasions, so 82, 92, 96, 2006, and now, 2023/2024, and how Israel has, conducted warfare. Their tactics don't change in terms of how they target individuals, peoples, cities, so on. But their warfare becomes much more, developed. To talk a little bit about my writing, I focused on the use of white phosphorus in the south, and I looked at how it affected the lands and the people and the agricultural sector in Lebanon. Because just to make this point very clear, by Israel bombing Lebanon with white phosphorus, this doesn't only affect the south. It doesn't only affect the people of the south. It affects Lebanon's agriculture, Lebanon's economy, and the survival of its environment in the future. So it's safe to say that when Israel is conducting its raids, it's not thinking about short-term damage. It's also thinking about long-term damage. Even though there isn't as much research on how white phosphorus can affect for decades to come, the chemicals it releases into the land, or that it releases into the air, remain there. And so that means that these farmers whose lands have been affected are not going to be able to harvest like they've done before. The olive harvest is not going to be as fruitful as it was before. And these towns in the south, particularly near the border, they produce about 1/5 of the profit that Lebanon makes from the olive harvest when it exports. So imagine how that's going to affect our economy for the years to come. And very important note, our economy is already not healthy. So these hits that it's sustaining are not, it's not going to make it any better. It's going to make it even worse. So Israel has used white phosphorus during its invasions in the past in Lebanon, particularly on the south, but also during the invasion of Beirut in 1982. But this is the first year that we've seen them use this as much or target agricultural areas or green land as much. They've never done this in this intensity before, which comes to show that they are thinking about damaging the land long term. Even before, I think this is also something that would be interesting to talk about, is even before them using white phosphorus or before everything post October 7 started, they have taunted farmers in the South, so they've always been quote unquote a menace to agricultural workers and farmers in the South, whether it be through shooting cattle in the middle of the night for fun, whether it be destroying some of the land on the border so they can build even higher bordering walls. So all that to say is, looking historically and looking at it now, what these tactics shows is them wanting to exert as much damage as possible, not only affecting, their so-called military targets, but also affecting civilians and also affecting Lebanon's different sectors, whether it's the agriculture or the economy or the environment per se.
Thank you. Bushra, you're up next.
Oh, let me introduce Bushra. Bushra, are you there? You're somewhere.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. All right. So this is Bushra X. She's a Syrian American activist originally from Northwest Syria. She's a civil engineer with 2 master's degrees, one in civil engineering and another in sustainability. She works as the lead in a Department of Environmental Protection, and she also volunteers with a local environmental organization as a consulting engineer. And Bushra, is it okay if I give you a 20-minute time cue?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. All right.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Let me know if you see it.
Yes, we see it, and hopefully your slide. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so hello and thanks for joining today. I'm Bushra and I will be talking about the environmental conditions in Syria pre and post-revolution. I'll start with a quick overview of the climate in Syria. So Syria has a combination of arid and semi-arid environments, a majority of area covered by desert, 2% forests, 1% water. Mean annual precipitation is 24 inches and mean annual temperature is 68 Fahrenheit. Oh, take this out of the... For a given year, the rainy season is in the winter with the temperature that could reach 32 Fahrenheit or less. And summers are dry with barely any rain and high temperature that could reach 100 Fahrenheit. To see the effects of climate change in this area, the upper chart shows the change in precipitation between 1901 and 2022. And we can notice a slight decrease in the trend line, showing a little decrease in rain, which is in the dark blue line. The lower chart shows the change in temperature in the same period, and we can see a clear increase in the trend. So climate change is definitely adding an additional environmental stress in the area. This map just shows the surface water resources in the country. We have a few small coastal rivers, in addition to the 2 main rivers, which are the Euphrates and the Tigris, that start from Turkey, passing through Syria and continuing to Iraq. 79% of this surface water is used for agriculture, and the big portion that you see in the middle is the desert area. So what is the environment state before 2011? It can be actually summarized by this picture that you see, which is supposed to be a forest. As you can see from the sign, it says the Assad forest. Forests are a national treasure. Let's maintain it from damage. And if you're asking why is it called the Assad forest, this just shows the regime's mentality that they own the country and everything has to have their name on it. So what led to reaching to this photo is that 41% of fires in the coastal forests were found to be intentional by logging and charcoal trade mafias. In terms of agriculture, The regime had full market control over the two of the most strategic crops in the country, namely cotton and wheat. So the regime buys the crops cheaply from the farmers and exports them in foreign currency. Such behavior is intentional to leave the farmers in bad shape and always reliant on what the government provides and keep the suburbs poor. Since I will be talking about water next, it's worth noting that 53% of irrigated farmlands are irrigated by groundwater. Rain and surface water are also used depending on the area. So moving to water, Syria underwent at least 2 recent droughts between 1999 and 2001 and between 2006 and 2009. That resulted in population displacements, particularly in rural areas before 2011 revolution. Data related to the water sector published by the regime is never transparent and is modified by the regime to suit its political and economic agenda, cover for their mismanagement and hide failed policies. The combined drought and mismanagement of water by the agricultural sector drove a lot of people from the countryside to the fringes of the cities, which led to unregulated housing and communities of discontented former farmers who played a major role in the development of the revolution. The combined drought and mismanagement of water also led to the decrease of annual per capita water availability almost by half. Another issue in the water sector is the drinking water losses from the system, which is caused by theft. So individuals with connections to the security officials withdraw drinking water to use it for their private swimming pools and orchards, while some cities would be without water for as long as 2 weeks in some cases. And finally, the amount of water coming to Syria from the Euphrates and Tigris did not reflect the amounts negotiated through interim agreements between Turkey and Syria, especially because Turkey continues to build dams on the Euphrates, which deprives farmers of the water necessary to irrigate wheat crops in the northeastern area. In terms of wastewater collection and treatment, not all the country is covered. There are 26 treatment plants in multiple provinces, but still none in Idlib, Deir Zor, or Suwaida. This results in pollution of ground and surface water sources through infiltration to soil. Adding to that is wrongful or excessive use of fertilizers and lack of environmental awareness, which exacerbates the problem further. One last thing is the government full control of water bottling through 4 factories run by the General Company of Water Bottling, which controls production, distribution, and have control over the prices. Hence, it is in the regime's own interest to not have a functioning water supply. So what happened after 2011? The Assad regime responded to the Syrian people's multi-ethnic, multi-sect revolution in 2011 with counter-revolutionary violence and suppression. What is happening there, what's happening in Syria is not a civil war. The Assad regime receives material support from the Iranian regime, and starting in 2015, the Russian regime joined his counter-revolution alliance. Here are some of the messages from the Syrian revolutionary struggle to the world. Not only is it an Arabian Spring, it's also a tsunami that will uproot all the dictatorship regimes all over the world. It's not a civil war, it's a genocide. Leave us die, but don't lie. We are the people who know how to adore life. Neither the Russian bombing nor USA's ignoring will terminate us. Putin, glory can never be built on the skulls of children. We will live long enough to spit on your history. So how did the previous sectors change since the revolution? In terms of forests, the dire economic conditions are driving people to cut down trees for fuel in a desperate bid to survive. This leads to deforestation, which can exacerbate wildfires, creating a vicious cycle. It was also found that the percentage of intentional fires increased to 90% after 2011 because of the charcoal trade by armed militias related to the regime or to clear forests for real estate investments. Again, when it comes to agriculture, and as mentioned earlier, the regime was the only controller of the wheat and cotton markets. But since the revolution, with the chaos and spread of armed militias, the YPG has created market competition with the regime-related rogue militias. Each group offers different prices to farmers. Superficially, it appears that farmers would have a choice of who to sell their product to, but what keeps happening is that the YPG or regime-related militias would take revenge on farmers who deal with the other side. And because of that, a series of fires rampaged the wheat fields in northeastern Syria, owned by both Arabs and Kurds in 2019. In addition, in Idlib and Hama, witnesses confirmed that members of national defense, which are regime forces, and or civilians who are close to the regime intentionally started fires when the farmers refused to pay them bribes and royalties to let them harvest their own lands. So incidents like these will definitely affect the food security in these provinces, since wheat and consequently bread is the backbone of life in Syria. And if you see these pictures, it was like a funny thing when I was searching about the subject. I found different media outlets blame different entities for the fires. For example, Sputnik, which is a Kremlin outlet, says it's Trump who ordered the fires. Al Jadid, which is a Lebanese outlet, says it's ISIS. Al Alam channel, which is an Iranian outlet, says it's the American troops. And another Iraqi Iranian outlet says it's the Turkish occupation. So you can see how these four outlets provide cover for the regime, and consequently how hard it is to get accurate information. Other fires also happened in Hama and Idlib due to direct rocket shelling by the regime or Russian forces. As a result of all these factors, both cotton and wheat production catastrophically reduced by 80%. Then also because of the continuous bombing, irrigation systems and pumping stations were damaged. Combined with the lack of rain and absence of official government, the farmers had no choice but to use unregistered groundwater wells, which could cause total depletion of some water tables across the country in the long run. And so depletion of groundwater on its own is bad, but also it can cause even further problems, which is when there's no rain enough to replenish groundwater, this can cause soil salinity, which also leads to lower crop yields. And then the last thing about agriculture is the loss of farming lands for multiple reasons, such as internal displacement, which is a twofold problem because people are leaving their farms behind in conflict areas and migrating to refugee camps that are themselves built on previously productive farmland. This cycle will lead to land degradation and pollution. So moving to water again, water supply infrastructure and systems were severely damaged or destroyed since 2011 by multiple actors. At the end of 2021, 50% of water and sanitation systems across the country were not functioning. Some of the repairabilities for these facilities is hindered by sanctions, but for a good reason. For example, Syria is not able to get chlorine for water treatment because the regime can and has used it as a chemical weapon. Additionally, corruption in the areas under regime control prevents proper repair of damaged facilities. And because of the damage and inability to repair, we end up with high demand with low supply, which turned water into a black market commodity similar to fuel. The black market is controlled by networks of businessmen connected to the regime. And this desperation for water is driving 52% of families to use unsafe water, which contributes to waterborne diseases. Water was also used as a weapon to force people to surrender in instances, like one instance in 2014, which is a war crime. Another problem related to water is even smaller amount of water is coming through the Euphrates, since Turkey has been more hostile because of the SDF existence in northeast Syria, leading to less electricity generated from the Euphrates Dam, and then less groundwater supply that is dependent on pumps requiring electricity. And here we have a video showing how the regime bombed Ain al-Fiji in Damascus, which is a spring, the main spring water source in Damascus. Moving to wastewater, similar to water facilities, wastewater facilities also suffered significant damage. Currently, 70% of sewage is discharged untreated, resulting in serious risks to public health and significantly contaminating groundwater resources. And we have another public health risk is the water bought from unlicensed tankers, which also causes diseases. Lastly, water scarcity and pollution have also affected the health and quantity of livestock in the country, together with other reasons such as smuggling, population displacement, lack of animal feed, and reduction in veterinary services. And then after all the destruction caused by the regime's response to the uprising, the regime still had the audacity in 2017 to sign the Paris Climate Accord. Immediately following the uprising, though, there was a loose international consensus that the Assad regime was excluded from international summits. However, that started changing in 2018, and the international community started to invite Assad to annual COP summits, like the one recently happened in UAE. At that same time of that summit, however, French criminal investigation judges issued arrest warrant against Assad. So he ended up not going, but still sent his prime minister instead. This highlights the hypocrisy and greenwashing of both the regime and the international community. I also wanted to highlight other effects of the counter-revolution by Assad and Russia that are not necessarily environmental, but more of cultural and social. So first, cancer. Cancer patients have lower survival rates now due to low accessibility of treatment resulted by intentional targeting of medical facilities by the regime and Russia. It's worth noting, though, that one of the reasons for increasing cancer and embryos deformation cases is the American, Russian, and Iranian nuclear waste that the regime allowed to be buried in the Syrian desert in exchange for money. The second issue is the important cultural and historical sites are destroyed by multiple parties, in addition to increased smuggling of cultural heritage artifacts. And lastly, Syrians are currently experiencing a form of demographic change. Sorry. Similar to the West Bank settlements, since the regime is bringing Iranian regime allied Iranians in and giving them Syrian citizenships, and using legal tools, quote unquote, to confiscate refugees' homes and properties and facilitating for the newcomers to take over. This is a longer conversation, but what is happening is part of a long-term imperialist plan by the Iranian regime to take over the Arab region, including Mecca, ultimately. Oh, and this is a picture showing a tent in between some ancient rebels. So I also wanted to talk about some proposed solutions, or maybe if you want to say like hopes and dreams. So first of all, and most important, a political transition that ensures the complete removal of the regime and its deep state has to happen. And then ensuring the safe and dignified return of refugees and internally displaced people to their homes and lands. We need to also ensure Syria's fair share of the Euphrates water from Turkey. And environmental education is very important. And we need to come over the problems that we have with agriculture. We need to design anti-capitalist agricultural solutions to adapt to climate change. And we need an urgent repair of damaged water and wastewater facilities. We need to empower universities within Syria to encourage research and development in water resources, environmental and sustainability sectors. And we definitely need to support grassroots organizations like the White Helmets, the water supply company in Idlib, and the Free Syrian Engineers Union. These are just examples. There are definitely more. And before wrapping up, I just want to talk a little bit about Palestine. And of course, the behaviors of the Israelis are not any less genocidal or destructive than their Syrian counterparts. So just a few examples. Israel has been, since 1948, destroying farming lands and removing ancient olive trees to build settlements. Not only this is causing the loss of income resources for Palestinian families, but it's also an intentional emotional damage, since olive trees are highly regarded by Palestinians and Arabs in general as a symbol for connection to land, and almost religiously sacred, as it's mentioned in the Quran several times. Another example, in one report by Al Jazeera, it was reported in 2017 that Israel intentionally sprays herbicides near the Gaza border at the time of harvest, causing the destruction of entire crops on the Palestinian side, amounting to at least $1 million of losses. And lastly, we have contamination of soil with toxic explosive materials and debris in Gaza and Southern Lebanon. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you for being here, and I hope this was informative. And we have some resources here if anyone would like to get more information. Thank you.
Wow. That was amazing. Both presentations. I'm just, wow. Okay. So yeah, thank you so much, Bushra. We won't have time for all the things that people might want to discuss about these presentations. So it is, well, here it's 10 o'clock. So we've got I'd say 45 minutes for conversation, for discussion, for questions. And then we can bring in our two speakers at the end for any concluding comments, or if there are questions that come up, they can, answer them immediately, if that makes sense. So, would anybody like to,
our organization, we're mostly in Europe and the United States. We spend a lot of our time combating Russian disinformation, and Russian disinformation plus, Iranian and all the rest of these people, these so-called competitors to U.S. imperialism. They've had a lot to do with the fact that Syrians and Ukrainians and others get so little support from the Western left. And I really, I apologize for that. And we're really sorry. We're doing our best to try and break through all the garbage. But do you have any suggestions of how we can, attack this problem of all the lies that, that that have spread through the left and have caused people to support Putin and Assad and other horrible people like that. Thanks.
So just also there's a question in the chat for Bushra about what are the estimates of the number of Iranian settlers in Syria now? If you wanted to answer that now or later, that would be fine. For some reason, I can't see everybody at the top of my screen.
I don't have the numbers now. I'm sorry, but I can look.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. That's a big topic. John, go ahead.
I'd like to make a comment about capitalist agriculture in the United States and environmental destruction in the United States as it relates to the invasion of Ukraine and the counter-revolution in Syria, and some additionally Iran. And there's no surprise that we have our own share of environmental catastrophes here. As far as capitalist agriculture, I think maybe the Midwest is in some ways comparable to Ukraine as far as it being a breadbasket. And because of the capitalist methods of agriculture, we've had tremendous lowering of the water table underneath the soil. It's actually causing in some places, well, in most places, the land to sink because of that, and also tremendous loss of a very rich topsoil. We also have other environmental problems. You have, for instance, the whole problem of fracking, which is a really disastrous practice environmentally for a number of reasons. You'll also have tremendous urbanization of agricultural land being carried out at the behest of the real estate developers, who are tremendously powerful here. And from what I understand, I did an interview some time ago with Ukrainian socialist Denis Pilash, who commented that what the Russian invasion has not destroyed with its rockets, that the Ukrainian real estate developers have destroyed within Ukraine. So given all of that, and from what I understand, the invasion itself has made the class struggle much more difficult in Ukraine. And so given like some of this, like the Putinized left in the United States, groups like Code Pink and environmental groups would say, you see, that proves that what we need to do is just end the war, basically on Russia's terms, and also as far as Syria, basically that the Syrian people should just give up and allow Assad and his backers, including the Iranian, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to just completely run roughshod over everything in Syria. But there's one problem with that, and that is that the environmental damage in Russia and also in Iran, and from what I'm understanding from Bushra, also in Syria, is even worse. And the reason is that at least in the United States, you have a certain degree of freedom and you have protests and so on. But where you have dictatorships, like in those three countries, you don't even have that. You have no democratic check on the worst aspects of capitalism. And so, therefore, I think that what we're seeing, the environmental damage in those countries, it's even more important to defeat Assad and to defeat Putin and to defeat the Islamic Republic as a first step towards establishing democratic rights, and also as through which it makes it easier to fight for socialism, which capitalism is really the underlying cause of all of this, and is increasingly leading to dictatorships all around the world.
Okay, Talmadge, you go ahead, and then Eric. then I'll call on myself.
Yeah, I just want to thank Natalia and Bushra for just, I thought was a bang up, just excellent presentation. Made me really sad about what I see going on here. I think that one of the things that came to mind for me was Russia's rationalization of taking Kharkiv as establishing a boundary, a border area to, quote, protect Russia from US imperialism, not unlike Israelis trying to take out southern Lebanon in order to create a buffer from being attacked by Hezbollah. So part of what I understand is that there's a boundary conflict on all these struggles that are going on that are having environmental consequences at a deep level. The one point I want to add to John's point, in the United States here, I'm in California, and one of the problems that California has in the Central Valley here is the depletion of the water aquifers. That is because of the excessive use and by farmers and growers that are mostly growing crops for export, like pistachios and almonds, etc. What you're seeing is a depletion of the water aquifer, which is destroying the ability to have crops in the Central Valley. A large part of this, probably not unlike in Syria, has to do with the water lobby in Sacramento that is able to, if you all saw the movie Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, you know what I'm talking about, how those politics play out. And so what I see in Syria is an example of that on a massive scale, large scale. And perhaps something like that may go on, Natalia, in Ukraine as well. Almost mafia-like organizations that control water rights, distribution rights, grain distribution, etc. Clearly, it seems to be happening in Syria. I'm not sure I actually have a question because I think both of you answered them pretty well. More of a despair than anything else about this. Especially with, the one last point I had is in prior to the revolution in Syria, what I understand is one of the kickoffs of the revolution was a drought in the agricultural areas around Damascus that impoverished many farmers who couldn't grow their crops, and the Syrian government's refusal to pay subsidies to those farmers as a result of environmental damage, which led to the uprisings that later became the Syrian Revolution. Maybe you could comment, Bushra, on that phenomena, about what was the actual material kickoff for the revolution in Syria that happened, and how did it then get appropriated by the Syrian regime and redirected towards a battle against ISIS?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Bushra.
Oh, okay. So the problem with the agriculture is just, I think it's just one of the reasons. But the other reason is that the Arab Spring had started before that, like probably a few months before that, and people thought that, and the Assad regime has been there since 1970s, and just continuous dictatorship since then. So it's a lot of factors that I guess contributed to it. And then when people saw, including the agricultural problems, of course, and the drought and the mismanagement on all sectors. And then when people saw that, okay, maybe we can, like, other people are able to overthrow their dictators, maybe we can also do that too. So that's, I think, what was the thinking behind it. So it was multiple factors in addition to the agriculture, I think.
Okay. So I haven't, just want to remind speakers that maybe a 3 minute, 3 minutes would be the max for speaking. I haven't, as long as there's not a lot of people on the list who want to speak, then people can speak longer. But for the moment, I would like to encourage people to not take any more than 3 minutes. So with that, I'm going to call on Eric, and then Sam, and then Rachel. Oh, Eric, you're muted. Eric, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm quite interested in the importance of fossil fuels in this. Particularly the role is quite obvious in Russia, that the Putin regime is a petro-fascist regime. that wouldn't exist in the same way without the dominance of fossil fuels and the international markets for fossil fuels. I'm interested in wondering if either of the speakers could comment on that and the global impact of the oil and gas industry in supporting the far right, that is not only pushing very hard for a supporting Putin and but also pushing so hard to maintain the markets for particularly Russian and Iranian oil and gas.
Okay. So I'm gonna call on Bushra and Natalia a little later to answer your question, Eric, but we've got it captured. So great, thank you. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, first,
Yeah.
Natalia, those pictures you showed of the wheat fields burning. For anyone who, like me, has spent a fair amount of time on the roads in Ukraine over the years, is absolutely heartrending, because I know how much human misery that's causing both within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine because of the food stuff. I mean, it's such an all-encompassing problem when you talk about capitalism and imperialism, all of which is a giant system, which is creating the climate change, which is creating the wars with some human help. And as Bushra was talking about the disease implications of some of what's been happening in Lebanon and in Syria, a factoid people may not know is that since October 7th, there have been something approaching 750,000 severe diseases in the respiratory systems of people in Gaza that people have been able to count. And that in Ukraine, there has been, of course, a worsening of the TB problem, which has been present in Ukraine for many, many years. And that the other implication of these wars is almost certainly going to be an increase in the spread of HIV, hepatitis C, and various sexually transmitted infections over the periods of reconstruction. I would say that would happen will happen in Gaza too, but I'm not sure there will be a period of reconstruction there, since I tend to be very pessimistic towards Israeli power and intentions. So that, Megan just pointed out that COVID is, of course, a problem here, there, everywhere. And the far right, often helped by sections of the so-called left, have been attacking masking and even vaccines. So that the capitalism is in a situation of really global crisis, and the organization of capitalist agriculture may now be bringing us a flu pandemic, although I still have hopes that we'll avoid this one this time for a year or two at least. Anyway, that's all.
Okay, all right. Rachel.
You guys see me, hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, actually this is kind of goes in just right after, sorry, did you say your name Sam was? About food product problems. My question is kind of more about if we can tell the impacts of deliberate agricultural destruction on the most concrete level we can see in both, like on the Polish border and then on the Gazan border, of either disgruntled farmers, I don't know, agitators of whoever they are, like actually just slashing and destroying, you know, truckloads of grain, whether going in or out. I don't know how much that's directly contributing to, to food insecurity, or even also just, I'm wondering, I guess that's like the end of the line, but either further about with the Black Sea blockade, how much spoilage there was, that how much is it something that we can necessarily calculate at this point, and tying in to and also what is done with spoiled, wasted grains and other food products that are no longer of use. And also, to some extent, I was following this more last year about the struggles for, with grain and between Ukraine and other Eastern European countries in the EU, about travel, like time allowed to travel through. I mean, I know there was a lot going through the Danube, and then others trying to go all the way up to Gdansk or so forth. How much was able to be like salvaged, and how much spoilage was there, and was there even a way to transfer? I don't know. It might just be paying, what is it, Peter to Paul, however it is, to sell from one to the next. I don't know to what extent that could be ameliorated. Like how, I mean, obviously the Polish border thing was a mix of actual, or I guess any of the Ukrainian borders, a mix of actual kind of economic uncertainty and kind of paid sabotage. But I don't know how much of that is already finding a working solution, and how much has been lost, sort of, and how much waste has been made in the result. That's where I'm at, I guess.
Okay, all right. I'm going to call on myself. So to circle back to the point, one of the points I was trying to make in my introduction was really, where is the environmental movement and the climate change movement in opposing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and as well as supporting democracy in Syria? Because if you actually care about the environment and climate change, you cannot be neutral on those two crises, those invasions, or in Palestine either. And yet, I mean, maybe other people here know about it, but I'm not aware of really any strong voices on these issues. It's true, we were really happy to see that Greta Thunberg supports both Ukraine and Palestine, and she has tremendous influence. But the 350.org organizations in the United States, I don't see them saying anything or doing anything. And again, when we started looking into environmental organizations that might be interested in this presentation, we were really distressed to see the degree of Kremlin propaganda that comes in the form of pacifism, end the war now, ceasefire, or caused by the United States in Ukraine. The standard propaganda talking points. So that's a problem. That's a problem that we have. And I want to say something about, since Israel's invasion of Gaza and the genocide in Gaza, we have been really working hard to try to unite the struggles of Palestine and Ukraine. And there's been a lot of conversation in the chat about how to do that, and as well as Syria. But there's so much more that needs to be done. We know that the Palestine movement doesn't say anything about Ukraine. And there's also the problem of Iran, as Bushra alluded to. So in any case, I just want to keep that at the forefront of what we're talking about when we're looking for solutions. And there's, I said, 86 people signed up for this forum. About 40 people have stayed for most of it so far. And yet we need a lot more we need a lot more people to actually get involved in this project of uniting these struggles. So I'm putting in a pitch for that. There's one of the things I wanted to say. Well, okay, that's it for now. I'll call on Linda and then Megan.
Yeah. Yeah, this is kind of off, well, it's not really off topic, but early on in the war, I heard about plans by Russia to just basically harvest all the forests in Ukraine and cart off the wood to be sold somewhere else or something. And I mean, it's just, it's just one. I mean, there's so much other horrible stuff, caused by these people. But I was just wondering, was that plan more or less stopped by the resistance to the invasion? And are there any, are they still working on trying to denude, to wreck the forests in Ukraine?
Megan, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I wanted to hop in and echo what Cheryl was saying and a bit of what John was saying previously, and appreciate, what everybody's saying. All the comments are really rich. One of the things that Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign is very focused on that Cheryl mentioned is, our campaign to unite the struggles, right? And so one of the through lines that I start to see with these presentations, including like the conversation with Michelle Eade, is the use of white phosphorus, right? It's like, okay, so we can start to see the degradation of land with white phosphorus is occurring in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Ukraine, right? Like I'm fairly confident that that Russia has launched white phosphorus. They've definitely been launching it on Syrians, we know that. The other thing that I think we can really lean hard into when we have conversations with people is the population displacement aspect as it relates to capitalism in particular, right? Not just like intentional demographic change like you see with West Bank and the efforts in the genocide in Gaza, but yeah, like definitely we know that Russia is taking over, I believe it's Mariupol, right? And like there's real estate there that is formerly Ukrainian. They're selling it to Russians, just like the real estate development component of it is happening in all these locations, right? It's not just one of them, but like literally every single spot this is going on. And then just to also like expand the sphere of the conversation into Africa, because Russia has its hands very much in Africa. We know China has its hands there, but in addition to fossil fuels, we're seeing the extractive behavior of Russia in the mineral sector, right? In stealing African resources in addition to gold, which is, precious metals, but stuff that's like required for cell phone usage in Congo, all that stuff. So I think to whatever degree we can really try to name the international quality of these exploitations, that it's not just these single, like every country is swimming in its own lane, but it's like Russia has its hand in multiple locations, right? And I know we get chronically and constantly from the campus left that the US and the UK and the West is doing the colonizing, and it would obviously be a huge oversight if we do not start, and I know people in the room here, you guys will get this, but to continue to name this in terms of Russia in Africa, because the conversation is very much only the West is in Africa, and that's not true, right? Russia and China gets dropped constantly. So I just wanted to name that because we, it seems fairly clear that in order to actually get to where we need to be, we have to have an internationalism that unites the struggles. So I hope we can all continue on that path, and thanks everybody for all the work that you're doing.
So I'm going to call on myself because I want to bring everybody's attention to a great suggestion that Angela put in the chat, which was to create a signable letter that would be sent out to environmental justice and solidarity organizations, calling on them to support Ukraine, Palestine, and Syria. And so anyhow, I think we're going to work on that. I think it's a great suggestion. But the reason, and I'm bringing your attention to it, is because we need help. There are many people who came to this forum today because your main concern or focus is on the environment and climate change. So we may be sending you emails as a follow-up to this forum, asking for your help in distributing a letter and maybe doing more than that. So I just wanted to mention that. So we do absolutely plan on taking further actions. This isn't just an informational forum. We really want to try to do something about this. John, go ahead. You're muted. Can't hear you.
I'd like to add to what Cheryl said. Not only may you be receiving emails from us, but people that want to actually do something and participate in what we're trying to accomplish, just send us a note or put your name in the chat below and send us a note to help us take the initiative, drafting up letters and any other suggestions. So it's not only just us reaching the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign, reaching out to you. We hope you reach out to us.
Yeah. Okay, is there anybody else who hasn't spoken that would like to say anything or ask a question? We don't have to go until for another 20 minutes, but we want to give everybody an opportunity to speak, because even sharing your own experiences. Okay, Marit, I hope I pronounced your name.
Thanks. It's Merritt. Just to touch on what some other people had brought up in terms of questions of the common theme here of how do we unite the struggles? How do we create solidarity? Something that Bushra and Natalia had both talked about, specifically Bushra had mentioned about water as a weapon being used. This is something that I see a lot as a Canadian, Ukrainian Canadian. I live in Winnipeg, and we have most of our water coming from a place called Shoal Lake. It's an Indigenous reserve, and that is a reserve that has had a boil water advisory for the last 40 years. So as settlers living on colonized land, I think this is something that we really need to take into account for us coming from North America, of uniting the struggles of how do we decolonize our own thoughts? How do we decolonize our own politics when it comes to environmentalism? How do we reach out and make connections with Indigenous communities here on Turtle Island to discuss how we create global reach with decolonization, with war and environmental activism, and how we see environmental activism within the scope of these invasions. So I just wanted to bring that point up of, something John had mentioned about we sort of live in privilege here in the so-called United States and Canada with our democratic governments, but in reality, at least in Canada here, we live in ignorance. And I think connecting with Indigenous groups on Indigenous environmentalism and how we focus on creating those connections of how this affects people worldwide, whether Indigenous, whether settlers, and the global reach of imperialism. I think that's something that, especially for us who live in privilege here in North America, I think that's a really important part of our activism. So just something to chew on.
Talmadge.
Yeah, I just want to echo also what Marit said. I think that's really, really important, connecting with Indigenous communities about alternative methods. It seems like, and this is addressed to both Natalia and Bushra, that when I think about sustainable development, whether it's solar power systems or different kind of water systems that are developed, it seems to me, I guess the question I have is, even in the midst of war, what is being done on a sustainable basis around food supply, around energy supply, that's not dependent upon fossil fuels or old models of development that are industrially based with large capitalist enterprises. You mentioned small farmers, Natalia, which I thought was excellent because it shows their productivity. But maybe you can address the issue of the understanding or possibility of widespread solar power use, for example, not just in Ukraine, but in Syria and other countries where people are having struggles over energy supplies, and also different ways in which water can be acquired that are not dependent upon, for example, Turkey building dams that blocks up farmers' access to water supplies. So those are my questions.
Okay. I don't see any other hands. Before I call on Natalia to come back in and address anything that she'd like, Bushra, would you like to come in? And by the way, thank you so much for your presentation. As Tom had said, both of them made me very sad, but I especially was feeling that we don't hear the voices of Syrians with the expertise and experience that you have, and we need to have a lot more of that. So thank you so much for what you did, your presentation, and all of it. So anyhow, Bushra, would you like to come in and say anything?
Well, thank you first for inviting me to this forum. Nothing much. I just want to, I guess, comment on what you said earlier about environmental organizations. And it's exactly why I wanted to put that slide about the COP summit, because I feel it's really outrageous and like hypocritic that they still invite like Assad to these kinds of summits after all the destruction that he's done. So yeah, I totally agree with you. And also want to reiterate what Megan said, that we need definitely to be united in our combating for all these problems.
So when we write this letter, we should include a demand that Assad be disinvited from. There should be a disinvitation campaign for that conference.
Definitely.
Okay, we'll add that to our list. Okay, Bushra, go ahead.
Yeah, I just also wanted to comment on the solar power. I guess like I didn't research this like accurately, but from what I've been seeing on Facebook and stuff, now the areas under the regime control. So the regime took the opportunity that now there's no enough energy, and they are bringing solar panels from China, and through the mafia that is related to the regime, and they're actually selling it to the people now. So they're taking any opportunity to exploit the people like with any way possible. And then in the other areas that are not under the regime control, people are also using solar panels, and because they're bringing them from Turkey, which are better quality, mostly from the Chinese ones, to be honest, is what I heard also from people. But they're also, since now there's more kind of like opportunity in the areas that are not under the regime control, more opportunity for kind of people has more freedom and like innovation abilities. So they're trying to be innovative in like way to have power, and also not to be directly related to the Turkish power networks too, because it's also expensive still. So yeah, I guess there are more innovative ideas that are happening in the north.
Okay, Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bushra, for that. Well, something that Natalia said made me think about this. I guess it was kind of like the biofuels and just like alternative fuels and things. And so I wanted to weave into this quilt that we have going of how all of these struggles are so intertwined, which is if you follow or know anybody who's like in long COVID circles, COVID cautious, COVID aware places, and disability circles, people fighting ableism, there's been a lot of discussion as it relates to, let's say, so it's the pandemic and the environment, right? Which is the pandemic and all of these diseases are spreading because people are getting on airplanes. We have such a different context now where, you know, stuff flies all over the world, and that our, you know, the discourse that we get to continue having around like, is international travel like sustainable? is it even desirable? What does that mean, right? When you can, you know, what does it mean when the global north goes to vacation in Bali and gives COVID to the entire island? You know what I mean? Or brings bird flu to indigenous islanders who don't really usually have contact, stuff like that. And so I just wanted to like weave that in as an awareness, because COVID gets really downplayed, and I think it's actually much more significant in all of our struggles than we're talking about. And like public health generally has been extremely eroded, and that's also been by design by the, by capitalists, far right, and the neoliberal participation in it at this point. The corruption of the World Health Organization. It's the same stuff that like Bushra was saying with the COP28 summit. It's like the international community, quote unquote, is complicit, right? They're not going to solve the problems. They can't solve the problems. They're the source of the problems, right? As capitalists. So just wanted to fold that in, because with the pandemic, right? If you guys remember when the pandemic rolled out, a lot of really innovative, community supportive, like, wow, can we reimagine this? Can we reimagine working from home, not being as mobile? We don't drive our cars to work every day. We're, part of the drive to get everybody back in the office is a fossil fuel drive, right? Like they were freaking out about real estate and fossil fuel sales. So I think I just encourage us to get into that aspect as well, that the disability community is really talking about this, and we should not be excluded, and I consider myself a disabled person at this point. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that into the mix. Thanks very much, everyone. I really appreciate this talk today.
John, you get the last word.
Oh, well, hopefully Bushra will, because I have a question for her.
Oh, okay.
And my question is this: on the one level, we know that the Iranian and Syrian regimes are directly allied and complementing each other. But yet, my understanding is that there's something of a division between the Syrian and Iranian people. And so my question is to Bushra is there, to what extent is there an attempt, or is there an attempt of the resistances, both within those two countries and also possibly in the two diasporas, to reach out to each other and to start to work together around the issue of the environment, but also obviously around all the other issues in resistance to these two regimes? And what do you think of that idea of trying to build unity between those two resistances?
So I don't think there is, I don't know, what do you mean by differences? Do you mean like cultural differences?
No, for instance, I was talking with somebody, an Iranian opponent of the Iranian regime, who told me, well, the Syrian people don't care about us. That's just one example of so just that, from at least from what they were saying, there's not this is what they said. I don't know if it's true or not, but what they gave me the impression was that there's not really coordination between the two resistance movements.
There is, I mean, for here, us in the US, I think it's slight, like there is some kind of coordination, but it's not, it definitely should be better, because like me, for example, personally, and some people I know here, Syrians, in where I live and in like my general area, we usually try to attend some Iranian protests, and we few times attended some of their conferences that they do in DC. Yeah, and whenever there's any even small protest like locally here, we try to attend, but it definitely can get better. And I'm personally definitely with them in their struggle.